The LZX Pendulum consists of two LFOs and a full bandwidth crossfader. This allows you to crossfade different inputs all the way up to full video rates. It also allows you to input a voltage control signal, again up to video rates, to crossfade the two signals. Each LFO has an independent speed control and a shape switch, which goes between sine, triangle, and square. These can be mixed in with the input signals as well. The crossfader is controlled by this knob in the middle, or you can use a voltage control input. So let's look at a simple patch crossfading two different image inputs together. I'm going to take a still image from the memory palace into one input, and I'm going to take an image that's playing off the and/or1 media player into the other input. I'll take the output to my visual cortex. So now you see the image that's coming from the and/or1 player, and now you see the image that is coming from the memory palace. So I can manually crossfade between these, which of course is pretty useful. I could also take either of the LFOs, plug them into the crossfade VC in, and then use the LFO to crossfade between them. This input also accepts up to video rate though. So instead of an LFO, I could take the crossfade, come out from a prismatic ray, and you can start to get some really cool ways to combine images without using a keyer. And of course, this can be animated. And you can input basically any shape you can make in an LZX into here. If you have a way to insert a third image into your system, you could also use that to crossfade. Another neat feature of the pendulum is that the LFOs can be summed with these inputs. So as I start to adjust this knob, you'll see LFO 1 starting to affect the image. I'm going to switch this back to make this a little bit more clear. So as I bring the speed up, start to get some really cool flicker effects. You can have these slow strobes. You can bring the amount down a little bit. If you change the shape to a square, you get a simple on-off. And of course you can do this with both channels. So as I start to mix into B, you get a little more movement on there too. And then of course with the memory palace I could start to animate the still image. And you can get some really complicated things going on. So that's an example of the pendulum as a modulated crossfader. Now let's start to look at some shape synthesis with the pendulum. You can also use the crossfader to fade between the different LFOs. So I have two LFOs here set at different speeds, and I'm using them to modulate this circle shape. I'll set them both to triangles so you can see better. So as we crossfade, let me set this one a little bit slower. You get one very slow and one very fast. So once I have two speeds that I like, I'm taking the output into the threshold of a doorway. And this is just keying a basic circle ramp. If I plug a prismatic ray into the crossfade voltage control, it starts to affect where each LFO is impacting that keyer. So you can see the effects of the slower and the faster LFO at the same time in different parts of the image based on those stripes coming from the prismatic ray. This allows you to create a number of very complex modulation effects very quickly. And of course, by changing the shape of the LFOs, you can get even more varied effects. And as we change the different amounts of voltage control and the different thresholds, start to get some pretty cool stuff. So this is just one way that the crossfader helps you get more out of each of the individual LFOs. To get more complicated, we can start plugging other image sources into the inputs on the pendulum. So here I'll go back to our video input. And so now we're summing that with the LFO here. I could take that LFO out and then I can mix it back in to get some different effects. I'll switch this back up to sine so we get something a little bit smoother. I'm going to plug a different ramp into this input. I'll go with just a vertical ramp. We can get some more dramatic shapes. And then by playing with your different LFO speeds, start to get something really cool. And you can experiment with many different inputs. I could put a noise texture in here instead. And obviously you can put full complex shapes in, memory palace patches, etc. The pendulum allows you to add a lot of depth beyond just a basic LFO to your shape synthesis patches. So now let's look at a slightly more complicated shape synthesis patch with the pendulum. In this case, I have an H plus V ramp that's creating a circle into the first input on the pendulum, and I have the H minus V ramp plugged into the second input. The cross VC is controlled again by a prismatic ray. The output is going to a staircase, which in turn goes into the source of a doorway. The threshold of the doorway is being controlled by LFO 1, and then the key output is being sent to the visual cortex. So as we up the speed of LFO 1, you can clearly see the effect on the threshold. We can adjust those settings. Get different effects. I'm going to slow that back down. And the crossfade coming from the prismatic ray is just basically some simple horizontal bars. You can see the effect as I start to scroll through there. And if I adjust the crossfade here, you can sort of start to see what that's doing. This is with no modulation, you just have the circles. As you crossfade, you get that H minus V ramp, and you get that H plus V ramp. But when you start to modulate it around those bars, you get some really interesting shapes. And obviously, as you start to up this control, it starts to change. If I free this from sync, I can start to get some scrolling modulation and calm that down. There we go. And this patch gives you a lot of different controls to play with. If you start to mess with the thresholds of the key, you can get everything from blobs to these kind of outline shapes. Obviously, you can up the frequency on the staircase to get more detail and more intricate designs. And you can also take the LFOs and start to sum those into these inputs as well. Let me just get this back so that it stops disappearing. So as I start to sum in the LFOs, we start to get a whole different level of modulation. So I think the coolest thing about Pendulum is that it lets you work on like 3 or 4 different dimensions of modulation at the time, all from a single module. Being able to input video rate sources, as well as summing with LFOs inside the module, is really cool. It has applications in shape synthesis and pattern synthesis and in image processing. In addition to all of that, you could just use it as a simple dual LFO to modulate any of the parameters on your LZX system. It's a great partner for the memory palace with all of these VC inputs, and really it's a great partner to anything in the system. If you have any questions or ideas of your own for Pendulum patches, please leave them in the comments.